The Atlantic Ocean is vast, merciless, and indifferent. For centuries, it has swallowed ships whole, erased entire crews from history, and reminded mankind of its unyielding power. Yet on May 26, 2013, deep beneath its dark and turbulent waters off the coast of Nigeria, something happened that no one could have expected. Something so unbelievable that it defied logic, science, and even faith itself. This is the story of Harrison Okene, a man who went to work one ordinary day as a cook aboard a tugboat and ended up spending nearly 3 days trapped 100 feet below the surface of the ocean, in total darkness, freezing water, and utter isolation. A man who survived where no one should have survived. Viewer discretion is advised. It began like any other morning for Harrison. He was the cook aboard the JASCON-4, a tugboat supporting Chevron's oil platforms off the Nigerian coast. The crew of 12 men lived and worked together in the cramped quarters of the vessel, a floating home and workplace rolled into one. The waters off Nigeria were notorious for their unpredictability. Sudden squalls, shifting tides, and waves that could swallow small ships whole, but for the men of the JASCON-4, it was routine. They had weathered storms before. Harrison prepared breakfast that day as he always did. Eggs, bread, and tea for the crew. The morning passed quietly. Nobody knew that within hours their vessel would be upside down on the ocean floor, their lives hanging in the balance. By late morning, the weather began to turn. The wind picked up, waves grew taller, and the tugboat pitched harder with each passing swell. Harrison didn't think much of it. Storms were nothing new here. But this time was different. Without warning, a rogue wave slammed into the JASCON-4. The ship lurched violently to one side, alarms blaring as the crew scrambled to regain control. Then, another wave struck, and another. The vessel began to capsize. Panic spread through the narrow corridors as men shouted orders, grabbed life vests, and tried desperately to escape. Water poured in through open hatches. Lights flickered and died, plunging sections of the ship into darkness. Some crew members managed to escape into the raging sea, clinging to debris as the tugboat rolled over. Others were trapped inside. And Harrison Okene, he was deep in the belly of the ship when it flipped upside down. In seconds, Harrison went from cook to castaway, from safety to certain death. He was thrown violently across the tiny bathroom he had taken refuge in as the ship flipped. Water rushed in like a living thing, cold and merciless. But then, miraculously, he found himself in a small pocket of air, a bubble trapped inside the overturned vessel. It was barely enough space to keep his head above water. Darkness surrounded him. He could hear the groaning metal of the ship's hull, the rush of water filling compartments, and, faintly, the screams of his shipmates as they were swallowed by the sea. Then, silence. Total crushing silence. Harrison was alone. As hours passed, Harrison understood the reality of his situation. He was trapped 100 feet below the surface, with no food, no fresh water, and no idea if anyone even knew he was alive. The temperature inside the air pocket began to drop. The water was icy, leaching the warmth from his body. He had no light except for the faint glow from his soaked phone, which soon died. Every sound, a groan of shifting metal, a distant thud, made his heart pound. Was the ship collapsing further? Would his tiny air pocket disappear? He prayed. He begged God for a miracle. And above him, divers were already beginning what they thought was a recovery mission, not a rescue. Because no one believed anyone could still be alive down there. As night fell over the Atlantic, Harrison Okene remained trapped in darkness, unaware that his story was only just beginning, and that it would soon become one of the most extraordinary tales of human survival ever recorded. The JASCON-4 was no longer a ship. It was a coffin turning over in the violent Atlantic swells. Harrison Okene clung to the bathroom doorframe as the vessel tilted beyond reason. He didn't have time to think. The roar of the waves outside, the metallic screech of tearing steel, the shouted orders of the captain, all merged into one terrifying symphony. The ship rolled, first 30 degrees, then 40, 50. Plates, furniture, and cooking equipment crashed down the passageways. People were screaming. At 60 degrees, Harrison was thrown across the tiny bathroom like a rag doll. His head slammed into the wall, water surged in from the hallway. He choked as the first wave of salt water rushed over his mouth. The ship rolled completely upside down. Suddenly, everything was weightless, spinning, a kaleidoscope of metal, water, and terror. Harrison hit the ceiling, now the floor, and water swallowed the lights. The vessel crashed against the seabed 100 feet below the surface. The impact was deafening. Everything loose inside. Chairs, dishes, toolboxes slammed downward into ceilings that had become floors. Harrison was alive, somehow. He coughed, gasping for air as seawater surged around his chest. He pushed against the bathroom door, but it jammed. The room was filling fast. Frantic, he ducked underwater and pushed with all his strength. The door budged, then swung open, releasing a rush of trapped air. He swam into the corridor, now completely inverted, furniture blocking the way like a wrecked jungle gym. He surfaced in a small air pocket near the ceiling of the hallway, gasping. Darkness pressed around him, lit only by the faint glow of emergency exit signs beneath the water. Then came the screams. Through the metal walls of the ship, Harrison heard voices, desperate, terrified voices. Crew members pounding on walls, shouting for help, gasping for air before water silenced them forever. One by one, the voices faded. Harrison held his breath, straining to hear anything over the groaning steel hull. The ocean was crushing in around them. The air felt heavy, damp, poisoned with diesel fumes from ruptured tanks. And then, silence. It was the most horrifying silence he had ever heard in his life. Harrison found refuge in a small air pocket in the engineer's office, barely enough space to keep his head above water. He climbed onto an overturned table floating beneath him. His clothes clung to his body, soaked and freezing. He had no food, no fresh water, no light except for a single waterproof flashlight he found drifting nearby. His phone was ruined. He was utterly alone. Hours crawled by. He listened to the groaning hull, the bubbles rising from ruptured pipes, the distant hum of the ocean above. Time seemed to warp. Minutes felt like hours. And every few moments he wondered, how much oxygen did he have left? As the night wore on, exhaustion set in. Harrison's body shivered uncontrollably. His lips were blue, his muscles aching. And then came the hallucinations. He thought he heard voices again. He thought he saw shapes in the dark water, just below the surface. Faces of his shipmates, staring silently before sinking away. He shook his head, muttering prayers under his breath. He was a man of faith, and now, more than ever, he needed God to hear him. "Father, please, not like this," he whispered. He didn't know it yet, but help was on the way. Up above, the storm eased. Search and rescue boats scanned the waves for survivors. Divers prepared to descend to the wreck, assuming they would find only bodies. Nobody expected to find anyone alive. The ship had been upside down on the ocean floor for nearly 12 hours now. At that depth, survival was impossible, or so they thought. As dawn broke on the second day, divers slipped into the water to begin recovering the dead. What they didn't know was that below them, in the darkness of the overturned ship, a man still breathed. A man who had defied the ocean itself. Time is a strange thing when you're trapped in darkness. For Harrison, minutes stretched into hours, and hours felt like entire days. His watch had stopped when the salt water seeped in, so he had no way of knowing how long he'd been there. His only companions were the groaning metal walls of the JASCON-4 and the sound of his own breathing, fast, shallow, panicked. Above him, the air pocket seemed to shrink slightly as water seeped in through tiny cracks. Each ripple sent a new bolt of terror through his chest. How long before this space was gone too? Harrison hadn't eaten since breakfast the day before. The human body can survive without food for weeks, but water is different, and the only water around him was the salty Atlantic, deadly to drink. His tongue felt like sandpaper, his lips cracked. He thought about dipping his hand into the water and drinking just a little. But he knew better. Salt water kills. Still, his thirst grew into a living thing inside his throat, a gnawing, clawing monster demanding relief. He prayed again. It was all he had left. The water was freezing. Even though he was partly above it on the overturned table, his legs and waist were constantly submerged. His body trembled violently as hypothermia crept in. He tried to move, to keep his blood flowing, but the space was too small. Every shift sent echoes through the metal hull. He hugged himself, teeth chattering, whispering, "Please, God, please." The cold wasn't just in his body anymore, it was in his mind. It made thinking harder, made fear louder. Then came the fish. Tiny movements in the water brushed against his legs. At first he thought it was debris. Then he felt the unmistakable slither of something alive. In the pitch-black water, creatures were exploring the wreck. Some were scavengers. His heart pounded. He splashed wildly, yelling into the dark to scare them off, but it only reminded him how alone he was, and what else might be down there with him. By the second night, Harrison's thoughts began to unravel. He prayed constantly, reciting the same words over and over, clinging to faith like a lifeline. But exhaustion was winning. Hallucinations returned. He swore he heard knocking, voices calling his name, even the sound of a helicopter overhead. But there was nothing. Only the dark, cold tomb around him. He imagined his wife's face. The thought of never seeing her again cut deeper than the hunger or the cold. Every breath tasted heavier now. He realized the air in the pocket was turning stale, poisoned with his own carbon dioxide. Each inhale felt thicker, like drinking air through a straw filled with smoke. His chest hurt when he breathed too deeply. He tried moving closer to the ceiling, where the last layer of oxygen clung desperately. But it wouldn't last forever. Then he heard something. A distant clang, metal on metal. It was faint, but real. Divers. He froze, listening. Another sound, and another. His heart pounded wildly. He screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the wreck. He had no way of knowing if they could hear him. The sounds grew closer, then stopped. Harrison didn't know it yet, but the divers thought they were recovering bodies. Hours crawled by again. His thirst was unbearable, his body weak, but his mind clung to the idea that someone, somehow, might find him. He whispered to himself, "They have to find me. They have to." At 60 hours trapped beneath the ocean, Harrison Okene was on the edge of death, cold, thirsty, breathing poisoned air, surrounded by the dead. And then, finally, the divers returned. What happened next would stun the world. On the morning of May 28th, nearly 60 hours after the JASCON-4 capsized, a team of professional divers prepared to enter the wreck. Their mission wasn't rescue, it was recovery. Nobody believed anyone could survive that long, trapped in a sunken vessel 100 feet below the surface. The divers expected to find bodies, maybe bring closure to families, nothing more. They double-checked their gear, oxygen tanks, dive lights, safety lines, underwater cameras, to document the wreck for investigators. As they descended into the cold Atlantic, the surface world disappeared behind them, swallowed by green-blue darkness. The divers reached the ship's twisted hull and located an opening. They moved carefully through the wreck, flashlights sweeping over broken pipes, floating debris, and silent corridors where water pressed in on all sides. The atmosphere was grim. One diver spotted a body floating near a doorway, arms drifting slowly in the current. Another lay slumped against the wall. They recorded everything, the cameras capturing what they assumed would be the final images of a doomed crew. Diver Nick Van Heerden led the team deeper inside. As his flashlight cut across a doorway, something moved. A hand. A living hand. It reached suddenly from the darkness and touched his outstretched arm. Nick froze. His brain struggled to process what he was seeing. It couldn't be real. No one should be alive down here. The hand gripped tighter. Nick surfaced inside a small air pocket, and there he saw him. Harrison Okene, eyes wide, trembling, alive. The diver's helmet camera recorded the moment. Harrison floated on an overturned table, staring like a man seeing angels descend from heaven. The diver grabbed Harrison's shoulder and gave a thumbs-up signal. Harrison could barely respond. His voice was hoarse, his body weak. But he was alive. Against all odds, against the ocean itself, he had survived nearly 3 days trapped in darkness. Nick radioed the surface team. "We have a survivor. Repeat, we have a live one." The words stunned everyone topside. At first, they didn't believe it. How could anyone be alive after 60 hours underwater? But the diver's voice carried no doubt. Plans changed instantly. This was no longer a body recovery, it was now the most delicate rescue mission imaginable. Harrison was weak, dehydrated, and hypothermic. The divers gave him water and wrapped him in a thermal hood to warm his head. They carefully explained through gestures that they would bring him out slowly, too fast, and the pressure difference could kill him. He nodded weakly, he was ready. But deep inside, fear gnawed at him. He had survived so much already. Could he survive the journey out? The divers fitted Harrison with an oxygen mask. They explained the decompression stops they'd need to make. Too quick a rise, and nitrogen bubbles in his blood could cause a deadly condition known as, quote, the bends. Slowly, carefully, they guided him out of the wreck into the cold Atlantic water. It was the first time Harrison had left his tiny air pocket in nearly 3 days. They rose in stages, stopping at decompression points to let Harrison's body adjust. Minutes felt like hours. Harrison clung to the diver's arm, shivering violently, praying under his breath. Above them, sunlight shimmered faintly through the water like a promise. Finally, after nearly 3 days trapped in darkness, Harrison Okene broke the surface. He gasped as sunlight hit his face. Rescue crews pulled him aboard, wrapping him in blankets as cameras recorded every moment. For the first time in 60 hours, he was safe. The miracle was complete. News of the rescue exploded across the globe. The video of the diver finding Harrison alive went viral within hours. People couldn't believe it. This man had survived what no one thought possible. Harrison himself was dazed, struggling to process everything. He had gone from death's doorstep to worldwide headlines overnight. Harrison was alive, but the story wasn't over. He still had to recover physically and emotionally from the ordeal of a lifetime. The moment Harrison was pulled onto the rescue vessel, medics sprang into action. He was barely able to stand, his body trembling violently after nearly 3 days in freezing water. His skin was pale, lips cracked, eyes bloodshot from salt and exhaustion. The crew wrapped him in thermal blankets, slipped an oxygen mask over his face, and began checking his pulse, his breathing, his temperature. He was alive, but his ordeal wasn't over. The doctors knew the human body isn't meant to survive that long under such conditions. Decompression sickness, hypothermia, organ shock, all were real dangers. Harrison was rushed to a decompression chamber on shore, a large, pressurized steel capsule used to treat divers suffering from the bends. Inside, doctors slowly adjusted the air pressure to match what his body had endured underwater, giving his blood time to release trapped nitrogen bubbles safely. He lay there for hours, weak but conscious, the nightmare of the sunken ship still playing behind his eyes. As his body began to stabilize, Harrison started to talk. He described the darkness, the cold, the hallucinations, the feeling of hearing his crewmates die around him, one by one, until only silence remained. Doctors and rescue workers listened in stunned silence. One diver later admitted, "We expected death. Not this, not him alive." When the helmet camera footage of the rescue hit the internet, the world exploded with disbelief. Headlines screamed about the man who lived under the sea. News anchors replayed the moment when Harrison's hand grabbed the diver's arm over and over again. Social media called it a miracle. People wanted to know everything. How did he survive? What did he eat? What did he feel, alone in the dark for 60 hours? When Harrison was strong enough, journalists swarmed the hospital. He spoke softly, humbly about prayer, about fear, about the moment he thought he would never see his wife again. "I prayed," he said simply. "I prayed so much. I told God, if you save me, I will never forget." His words carried weight. This wasn't just survival, it was faith, willpower, and something greater than luck. When Harrison finally left the hospital, his wife was waiting. They embraced for a long time, both crying. She had believed she was a widow for 3 days. Then, suddenly, he was alive again, standing in front of her. That moment, the reunion, was worth more than any headline or interview. But there was grief, too. 11 of Harrison's crewmates had died in the sinking. Families mourned as bodies were recovered in the days following his rescue. Harrison attended memorial services quietly, laying flowers, his face heavy with survivor's guilt. He had lived. They had not. In the weeks after the rescue, Harrison battled nightmares, flashbacks, and the weight of his experience. Doctors warned him about post-traumatic stress, about the mental scars that often last longer than the physical ones. But slowly, with family support and faith, he began to heal. Harrison Okene's story was far from over. The world now knew his name, but few understood the depth of what he had endured, or how it would change him forever. Months after the rescue, Harrison stood on a dock, staring out at the same ocean that nearly took his life. The waves rolled gently, the air smelled of salt and rain. He felt both fear and respect for the water. It had almost killed him, but also given him a second chance. Reporters asked if he would ever go back to sea. Harrison hesitated and shook his head. "Not like before," he said. "I can't." Even as he healed physically, Harrison struggled emotionally. 11 men had died. He had lived. At night, he dreamed of voices in the dark, of cold water rushing in, of the silence when everything went still. Survivor's guilt, doctors called it. He carried it silently, knowing families were still grieving while he walked free. The helmet camera footage from the divers' rescue team exploded online. Millions watched as a hand reached out from the wreckage, grabbing the diver in desperation. The diver's shock was visible even through his mask. The moment became one of the most watched rescue videos in internet history. People called Harrison the man who lived under the sea. TV shows wanted him. Newspapers printed his story. Harrison spoke in interviews, but never with drama or ego. He described it simply: prayer, hope, darkness, survival. He said, "I was not alone in there. God was with me." The world was fascinated, but Harrison only wanted peace. Despite fame, Harrison struggled with what doctors called post-traumatic stress disorder. He avoided boats. The sound of rushing water made his heart race. But therapy, family support, and time helped him heal, slowly, piece by piece. Harrison credited faith for his survival. He spoke often about the hours spent praying in the dark, the sense that something greater than himself had kept him alive. Churches invited him to speak. He told congregations, quote, "I was not supposed to live, but I did, and I believe God heard me." Rescue teams received awards for their bravery. The divers who found Harrison described it as the most unforgettable moment of their careers. Some said they had never seen anything like it before or since. Harrison himself received letters from strangers worldwide, people inspired by his will to live. Harrison eventually left deep-sea work. He trained as a cook onshore, working in restaurants instead of ships. Life became quieter, simpler. But every time he saw the ocean, memories stirred. "It never leaves you," he said once. "The dark, the waiting, the silence." Today, Harrison's survival story stands as one of the greatest in modern history. It's taught in diving schools. It's discussed in survival training. It reminds the world how thin the line is between life and death, and how strong the human will can be. Years later, Harrison visited the ocean again. He stood where sky met water, the same horizon he once thought he'd never see again. He was no longer the man trapped in darkness. He was the man who lived. And that made all the difference. Years after the accident, Harrison Okene sat for one final interview. He spoke slowly, with the weight of a man who had lived through something few could imagine. "I was in the dark for 3 days, he said softly. 3 days when I thought I was gone, but I came back." He paused, then added, "I carry the memories, the voices, the silence, but I also carry gratitude, because I got another chance." Before the cameras ended, Harrison insisted on speaking about the 11 men who didn't make it. "They were my brothers," he said. "I lived, but they didn't. I never forget that." Memorials were held each year. Families gathered near the sea, reading names, casting flowers into the waves. The ocean had taken much that day, but it had also given back a single, unlikely survivor. Experts studied the incident for years. They discussed the air pocket, the temperature, the way Harrison had rationed his energy and stayed calm under impossible conditions. But beyond science, beyond survival tactics, there was something deeper: the will to live. The belief that no matter how dark it gets, there might still be a way back to the light. Today, Harrison Okene lives a quieter life. He cooks. He visits the sea, but doesn't sail on it. He spends time with family, with faith, with the simple things he once thought he'd never see again: sunrise, laughter, home. He will always be known as the man who lived under the sea. Harrison Okene's story is a reminder of the fragile line between life and death, of courage in the face of terror, of faith in the darkness, and of how sometimes the human spirit can endure the impossible. Thank you for watching. Subscribe and follow for more true survival stories from around the world.